His teacher never called on him until the day she decided to humiliate him in front of everyone, but when he started playing, the look on her face said it all. She never saw it coming. Elijah Rivers sat near the window pencil, tapping rhythmically against his notebook. It wasn't nerves, just a habit, one his mother always told him to break. But it helped him think the classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with the usual pre-lesson chatter. But Elijah kept his focus on the worksheet in front of him. He liked getting things done early. Miss Abigail Thornton stood at the front of the room skimming her notes. She had been teaching 6th grade for nearly 15 years, and in that time she had developed a reputation strict but fair, at least in the eyes of those she favored. Elijah had never been one of them. It was never obvious. She didn't raise her voice, didn't insult him outright, but she rarely called on him when his hand was up. If he got a question right, she moved on quickly. If he got one wrong, rare. As it was, she lingered, almost savoring the moment Elijah noticed, so did a few of his classmates. "Yo, she barely even looks at you." "Tyler Whitman?" The boy sitting next to him whispered one afternoon, "You got like teacher invisibility or something." Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But today, something felt different. Miss Thornton was glancing his way more than usual, not in a way that signaled trouble, but something else, anticipation. The lesson began a standard history discussion, something about the Civil War. Elijah took notes, listening, waiting for the usual pattern to repeat. But then, something unexpected happened. "Elijah," Miss Thornton said, her voice crisp, "why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Elijah blinked. She never called on him. He sat up straighter, scanning the board. General Sherman's March to the Sea was a military campaign aimed at breaking the Confederacy's resources and morale. She murmured. "Not bad, not bad." It was a textbook. Perfect answer. A few students exchanged glances. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that?" about the lesson, carried on. But the shift had been made. Miss Thornton wasn't ignoring him anymore. She was watching. And then, right before the bell rang, she made her move. "Elijah," she said. As students began packing up, "Stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned again, but no one said anything. Elijah took his time putting his notebook away before approaching her desk. "I overheard you talking the other day," she said. Clasping her hands together, "about your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." Something in her tone made the air feel heavier. He nodded. "Yeah, he was a pianist. Played jazz." Miss Thornton's lips curled just slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close interesting. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. "You must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure where this was going, but it didn't feel right. A little. He admitted. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good to know. The bell rang. Elijah grabbed his bag and turned toward the door, but her voice stopped him. "Tomorrow. Let's see what you've got." He turned back. "What, the piano in the corner?" she said, gesturing toward the old upright instrument, collecting dust at the back of the room. "You'll play something for the class." Elijah stared at her. A few remaining students had paused near the doorway, eyes flicking between them. Why Miss Thornton tilted her head, as if the question amused her. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Elijah knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't encouragement, it was a setup, but he wasn't about to back down. Elijah barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the conversation with Miss Thornton replaying over and over in his head. This wasn't a request, it was a challenge, and he knew exactly what kind. She expected him to stumble, to embarrass himself, to reinforce whatever opinion she had already formed about him. But she didn't know the full story. The next morning Elijah walked into the classroom feeling the weight of something unspoken. Word had traveled fast. Whispers followed him as he took his seat. "You gonna play today, Brandon Hall?" One of the louder kids smirked from across the room. Elijah didn't answer. "Didn't know you were a piano guy," Tyler murmured beside him. Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. There's a lot of things people don't know. Miss Thornton entered, setting her books down with an air of satisfaction. She barely acknowledged the students, settling in her focus, drifting toward Elijah before she began the lesson. The first half of the class dragged on, but Elijah could barely hear any of it. His mind kept skipping ahead to the moment she would call on him, and then she did well. She said, closing her book and glancing at the clock, "We have a little time before the next lesson, perfect." She turned toward the old, upright piano in the corner. "Elijah, let's see what you can do." The air in the room changed. Students shifted in their seats, some whispering, some watching closely. Elijah didn't move right away. He felt every eye on him. His heartbeat wasn't fast, but it was strong, steady. Then he stood. A few muffled laughs rippled through the room as he walked toward the piano. Someone muttered something he couldn't quite catch, but he didn't need to. He already knew the tone. Miss Thornton clasped her hands together. "Play whatever you'd like." Elijah studied the piano. It was old keys, slightly yellowed from age. A few of them chipped at the edges. He ran his fingers lightly over them just once. The instrument was out of tune. Not by much, but enough. He inhaled, sat down, rested his hands on the keys. He knew exactly what he was going to play. Then he heard it. Someone stifling a laugh behind him, a snicker, low but clear. It wasn't just about proving Miss Thornton wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone wrong, and he was going to do it in a way they'd never forget. The classroom had never been this quiet. Even Miss Thornton, who usually carried herself with a smug certainty, had an almost curious look in her eyes. The students leaned forward, waiting. Some expected a disaster. Others were just there for the spectacle. Elijah placed his fingers on the keys. They felt familiar beneath his touch, even though this piano was nothing like the one he had at home. His grandfather's piano had been warm, well-loved with deep, rich tones that filled a room effortlessly. This one, the keys were slightly stiff. The soundboard likely warped from years of neglect. A deep breath, a moment of stillness. Then he played. The first few notes drifted through the air, soft and steady. A blues progression, the kind his grandfather had played for hours on humid Arkansas afternoons. Elijah's fingers moved with confidence, rolling through the chords, his left hand keeping time while his right danced over the melody. The classroom shifted, the whispers stopped. Even the kids who had been smirking before sat frozen. Miss Thornton crossed her arms, her brows furrowing ever so slightly. She had expected hesitation, maybe a shaky start. Instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. Elijah didn't stop to see their reactions. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. He let himself sink into the music, feeling each note as if it were telling a story. Only he understood. His fingers glided effortlessly, striking a balance between precision and raw emotion. It wasn't just technical skill. It was a conversation between him and the keys, and then he took a risk. He shifted into something more complex, letting his hands weave intricate runs up and down the keyboard, a progression his grandfather had taught him, one he had struggled with for months before, finally mastering it. A deep rolling bass line pulsed beneath a soaring melody, notes colliding and resolving in perfect harmony. The longer he played, the heavier. The silence became. The weight of it settled over everyone in the room, wrapping around them like the very notes filling the air. No one laughed now. Tyler, sitting near the front, leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide. Brandon, who had cracked a joke earlier, had his arms crossed but wasn't smirking anymore. A few other students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and something else, something close to admiration. And then the crescendo. Elijah's fingers pressed firmly against the keys, striking chords that echoed against the walls. The music swelled, filling every inch of the room, every quiet space where doubt had once lived. He pushed harder, letting the final run carry the weight of everything he hadn't said. And then silent, the last note hung in the air for a moment before fading. Elijah lifted his hands, resting them on his lap for a second. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then a single clap. It came from the back of the room, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. Damn, Brandon, still sitting with his arms crossed, gave a small shake of his head. I didn't know he could do that. Elijah exhaled, his heart pounding. Not from nerves, but from the sheer energy of what had just happened. He had done more than play. He had changed something. The applause swelled, students looking at each other as if they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, something they would remember, but the loudest silence of all came from Ms. Thornton. Miss Thornton's face was unreadable. She stood by her desk, arms still crossed, lips pressed tightly together. The applause continued around her, but she hadn't moved, she hadn't said a word. Elijah sat still, hands resting on his lap, breathing deeply. He wasn't smiling, wasn't looking for approval. He just let the moment stretch, letting them all sit with what had just happened. Then finally, Miss Thornton spoke. Well, she said, her voice clipped. That was unexpected. The clapping died down. Students glancing between her and Elijah, a few kids still whispered excitedly. But the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. Where did you learn to play like that? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Elijah met her gaze, unflinching. My grandfather, something flickered in her expression, but it was gone too fast to name. She straightened. I see a pause. Miss Thornton tapped her fingers against her desk, the only sound in the now silent classroom. Then she turned to the rest of the students as if shaking off whatever thoughts had crossed her mind. All right, let's get back to our lesson. But nobody moved. Elijah glanced around. Tyler was still watching him, eyebrows raised, like he couldn't believe what he had just seen. A girl in the back. Madison Green looked almost annoyed, like the moment had been taken from them too soon. Brandon scoffed under his breath. That's it? Miss Thornton's eyes snapped to him. Excuse me, Brandon, shrugged, shifting in his chair. I mean, that's all you're going to say. He just played like... He gestured vaguely, like something you hear on TV and you're just going to move on. A few heads nodded. Miss Thornton's mouth tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes darted back to him, sharp and assessing. He didn't let her look away. That's why you called me up here. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Miss Thornton let out a slow breath. I simply gave you an opportunity to share your talent with the class. Elijah shook his head. No, you didn't. His voice was calm. Even you thought I'd mess up. That's why you asked more whispers. Miss Thornton's fingers curled slightly against the edge of her desk. That's enough, Elijah. But he wasn't done. You wouldn't have asked Tyler. He continued, glancing at his friend, or Madison, or Brandon. But you asked me why the room was holding its breath. Miss Thornton's jaw twitched. You're out of line. I don't think I am. Her eyes darkened, her posture stiffening. Sit down for the first time all year. Elijah didn't immediately do as he was told. He looked around the room at his classmates, at the ones who had ignored him before, the ones who had underestimated him, the ones who had smirked when she called his name. Then slowly he stood. The silence felt heavier, now charged. And Miss Thornton, for all her usual control, looked just a little bit shaken. But this time she wasn't the one in charge of the room. Elijah walked back to his seat, slowly feeling the weight of every step. His heart wasn't pounding anymore. He wasn't nervous. If anything, a strange sense of calm had settled over him. He lowered himself into his chair, still feeling the stares from all around him. Tyler gave him a slow nod, one that didn't need words. Madison was still watching, Miss Thornton arms crossed like she was waiting for something more. But Miss Thornton had turned away. She flipped open her lesson plan, eyes fixed on the page as if she could pretend nothing had happened. Let's move on. The room didn't shift back to normal. As quickly as she expected, the energy lingered. People still whispered. It wasn't just about the music anymore. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, kind of weird. How you don't want to talk about it. Miss Thornton's eyes snapped up. "Excuse me." Brandon shrugged. "You made a big deal out of him playing, but now you're acting like it never happened." A few quiet agreements rippled through the room. Miss Thornton's grip on her book tightened. That's enough, but Elijah had seen it. The hesitation, the discomfort, and so had everyone else for the rest of the class. Miss Thornton's usual authority felt thinner, like a glass window that had just been cracked. She still controlled the lesson, but the students weren't as engaged. The usual rhythm was gone when the bell finally rang. Chairs scraped against the floor as students packed up their things, murmuring to each other as they filed out. Elijah slung his bag over his shoulder, moving toward the door, but just before he stepped out, Miss Thornton called his name, "Elijah." He turned back for a second. She looked like she might say something meaningful, something real. Instead, her expression hardened. "I hope you understand that this is still my classroom." Elijah studied her then in the same calm, steady voice he had used before. He said, "I know." A beat of silence passed between them. Then he walked out in the hallway. Tyler caught up to him. "Bro, what was that?" He shook his head, grinning. You just flipped everything upside down." Elijah let out a breath. "Yeah," Tyler nudged his shoulder. "So you gonna play again?" Elijah thought about it, about the feeling of the keys beneath his fingers, about the music filling the room. He smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Because today he hadn't just played music, he had been heard. Elijah walked home that afternoon with a lightness in his step. The sun hung low over West Markham Street, casting long shadows as he weaved through the familiar route, the weight he had been carrying since yesterday. The tension, the doubt was gone at the corner store near his neighborhood. He stopped to grab a bottle of water. Mr. Henson, the older man who owned the shop, watched him with a knowing look. "You look like a kid who just did something important." Elijah hesitated, then smiled. Maybe I did. By the time he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother was at the stove humming as she flipped a fillet. "You're home late." Elijah dropped his bag by the door and sat at the kitchen table. Had a long day. His mother glanced over her shoulder. Good or bad? He thought about it, about the way the room had fallen silent, the way Miss Thornton had looked at him, the way his classmates had seen him differently, really seen him for the first time. "Good," he said. "Finally? Really good." She turned off the burner and wiped her hands on a dish towel before sitting across from him. "You want to talk about it?" Elijah nodded, and for the next 15 minutes he told her everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. Just listened, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and something else. Something softer, almost sad when he finished. She exhaled. "Sounds like you made her uncomfortable." "I think I did." She studied him. "And how do you feel about that?" He didn't have to think long, like it was supposed to happen. His mother smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Good. The next day, at school, things were different, not drastically. Miss Thornton still ran her class the same way, still called on the same students, still acted like nothing had changed. But the energy in the room had shifted. People saw her differently now, and they saw Elijah differently too. During lunch, a few students, ones who had never spoken to him before, stopped by his table. "Dude, you were insane on that piano." Madison said, sitting across from him, "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5. Tyler shook his head. "Man, you've been holding out on us." Elijah smirked. "Guess so." From across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton walked past Trey in hand. Their eyes met briefly. This time she looked away first. And Elijah, he just kept eating, because he had already said everything he needed to say. Some lessons aren't taught in books. Some moments change the way people see the world, whether they want to or not. Miss Thornton had spent the year looking past Elijah, and in just a few minutes he had made sure she would never do it again. Maybe she would never say it out loud. Maybe she would never admit what she had done, what she had assumed, but it didn't matter because now Elijah knew something that she didn't. When people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talent speak louder than their doubts. And when you do, they'll have no choice but to listen. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us to stand tall, no matter who's watching.